Hello, welcome to Z Marie Design. Let's create a snowman table runner, just in time for the holidays. So this is the pattern that I drafted on a 12 by 12 inch square. And this is the hat pattern that I drafted. So I traced my 10-inch round plate on my 12 by 12 inch square for the face. And I traced my notions container for the circles for the eyes. So I cut my background squares 12 by 12 inches square, and I also cut my beige and white fabric for the snowman's face 12 inches square. And these are the fabrics I'm using for his cheeks, his eyes, his hat, and his nose. And I'm going to use my fusible web to trace all of my pattern pieces, and I trace it on the paper side, and after I've traced everything, I iron it on the perspective fabrics that I've designated for each thing. So this is for the hat. After everything is ironed on, I cut all of my pattern pieces out. And once everything is all cut out, and I make sure that I have all of the pieces that I needed. These are the pattern pieces for a hat. And I'm going to place everything on using just following my pattern to make sure I have everything. So once I have all of the pattern pieces all fused together, I'm going to remove that paper backing from the fusible web. And it's easy if you score with a pin. Just make a little slit there. It makes it a lot easier for that paper to come off of that fusible web. If you start to remove it and some of the webbing hasn't been fused down, just put the paper back on and take it back over to your ironing surface and then just press it down. And just make sure that it's adhered. And then just score it again and remove the paper backing. So I'm going to continue on removing all of the paper backing on all of my applique pieces. I also fused some of the trims and ribbons that I'm going to use for the hat trim. And I'm going to remove all of that, and then I'll show you the next step. So now all of my fusible, the paper backing is all done, taken off. On my background square, I'm going to lay out all of my applique pieces following that pattern that I drafted earlier, just to make sure that I have all of my pattern pieces that I need and that I like the layout before I fuse anything down to the background surface. So I lay out the white, that'll be the part for his face, and I'm going to place down then my eyes, my nose, and then all of the hat pieces. Now, in hindsight, I'm going to do the hat pieces in one whole piece versus making it in sections. But I wanted to use a separate trim. That's why I did that. But I think next time I'll just do a whole piece for his hat. And for his cheeks, my fabric had apples on it, so I just cut out the apple shapes that were on my fabric that I'm going to use for his cheeks. So once I put the hat on, I know that I need to move his eyes down a little further and closer together before I take it to my ironing surface. And I begin to press everything on. So as you see, I don't have any fabric for his mouth. And I'll show you what I plan to do for his mouth in the next step. So now I'm going to press everything down, making sure to lift my iron up and down and not go back and forth so nothing shifts. And just follow the manufacturer's instructions. So once everything is fused down and I take it over to my sewing machine and I do a zigzag stitch or I do a blanket stitch around all of those applique pieces. And everything has been fused and sewn down to the background fabric. And you see I put some rickrack on that white trim ribbon that I have. And each of the trim on his hat, I put something different just to make it a little quirky and unique. And see I zigzagged that rickrack down. So at this point, your squares, you can sew them together to create your table runner. They are all ready to go. But before you do that, let's add a mouth. So for his mouth, I've decided that I'm going to use buttons on 3 of the squares. And then I'm going to do some free motion couching with some yarn on the other 3 squares. And I'll attach a link to show you how to do that free motion couching of that yarn. Now that everything is all done, and I could sew them together, but I want to add a little bit more detail, and I'm going to put some sashing in between each of the squares, and I'm going to upcycle some quilt binding that I have. So I'll cut that sashing, I'll cut it 12 inches in length, and then I'm going to attach it. So you see I've couched down my yarn for his mouth, and I've attached all of my buttons before I even put the sashing on. So next I'm going to attach the sashing in between each of those squares, and I'm going to alternate between the buttons and the yarn. So every other one will be buttons for his mouth and yarn for his mouth. So with right sides facing, I'm going to place that sashing, and I'm going to pin it down, and I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and the end, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance in between each of those. And once my sashing is all sewn on, I'm going to press all of my seams toward the sashing just to reduce the bulk. And now once everything is all pressed and my sashings are all put together, it's time to now sew each of my blocks together. So with right sides facing, I will begin sewing my blocks together, and I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end. And then once that's all done, I'm going to again press those seams toward the sashing. And each of those have sashings in between those blocks. I didn't put sashing on the end and on each of the ends because I'm going to do the quilt binding with that same sashing color, with that red. So the ends and the bottom and the top does not have any sashing. So at this point, my table runner is all sewn together, and now I'm going to create the backing fabric for my table runner. So I'm going to piece the backing fabric for my table runner, and I do the sashing in between just to tie the 2 colors together. I think I won't do that again because it makes it really difficult to match up those seams. I just didn't seem to be able to get them just right, but it'll be okay. So now that my backing fabric is all sewn and pressed together, I'm going to attach it to the front of my table runner. So with wrong sides together, I'm going to match up all of my edges, and I'm going to pin everything in place in order to take it to my sewing machine to begin my free motion quilting. And I'm going to do free motion quilting, and I'm going to do decorative stitching as well on my table runner. So that's the back, just making sure that all my edges that they all match up, and pinning everything in place. So this is my finished table runner with all of the decorative stitching and all of the free motion that I did. And this is from the back. And then I also attached that quilt binding to the ends of the table runner after I was all done with the free motion and the decorative stitching. If you want me to do a tutorial on how to attach and create quilt binding, just leave me a comment in the comment section. I'll be happy to do that. And on my sewing machine, I'm able to do some phrases and some lettering. So I did some holiday phrases on each of the hats, on the snowman's hat. and I also sewed that on there. So I really like how this turned out. You see the decorative stitching that I put on the sashing. So I hope you like this tutorial and I hope you'll give it a try. And my finished table runner, it measured 12 inches by 72. And I had 6 squares of the 12-inch fabric. And you can make that longer or shorter by decreasing the size of each of the squares or decreasing the number of squares. But I really like how it turned out.